think about it for a moment, but you probably have already thought about it. Here's a bloke talking to a bunch of women about women's health.
Yeah. It's right, they're fairly used to that.
I once, a very long time ago, spent a week in Massachusetts, out in the woods with a bunch of local students. So we and we just went through the whole group. They were all women, and I think about 75% of them were also gay. And they were the sort of women who didn't use Latin because it was a men's language, and everything had to be very gender neutral. And I survived that. So I'm hoping that we equally forgiving. So we're going to talk about Patho Phys. So we're going to look at things that can go wrong in women's health, and I'm assuming you got most of the physiology and anatomy fundamentals, but we're going to review that as we go along. So I thought we'd start at our leisure looking at the normal patterns of menstrual cycles and get our head around some of the particularly hormonal activities that are involved in that. And this is my favourite illustration of the conversation. It covers, there's a huge amount of information in there, so it's going to stay up the first part of the morning as our backdrop to this. And we'll first of all walk through it, and then we'll take a few adventures out from that. Do you recognise what we're looking at here? Yeah. Have you seen that sort of chart before? So you're familiar with the dynamics involved. Do you mind if I go over it again? Thank you. The first and the main point about all of this is that the menstrual cycle is a perfect example of the close integration of anatomy and physiology. Everything is moving. There's constant movement here, one part nudging the other. So there's a complete interaction here. There's no external puppet master here. This is the nature of the tissues and their behaviour actually creating the rhythm and the cycle. So the menstrual cycle is A, autonomous, B, self-organising, and that's a very important point for us as practitioners. It's self-organising. It does not need an external master or mistress or anyone managing this. This is internal dynamics. And it is extraordinarily robust. So that a woman in the Arctic, or in Australia, or in Africa, or in Russia, up a mountain, down a valley, by the sea, up a tree, has still got the same cycle, essentially, around the 28th day. But it varies, obviously. There is variation, but that's life. But it's astonishingly robust. And I'll cut to the quick immediately. That means our job is easy. All we have to do is to nudge it back to that self-organising state. We don't have to tell it to get back. All we have to do is nudge it. So we'll talk about women's remedies, and women are very good at finding remedies for their needs as we go through the morning. However, they all have probably the same principle in common. They nudge. They don't manipulate. They don't control. They don't dominate. They don't interfere. They simply give the thing a bit of a kick. and allow it to reorganize itself, because it is essentially self-organizing. And life is self-organizing. However, I use the menstrual cycle when I'm talking about self-organization, the whole notion of complexity. Have you come across the notion of complexity in chaos theory? The notion that life is essentially a self-organizing phenomenon. It doesn't have external controls actually at all. It's just the nature of the material creating its own organizing principles. This is a perfect example, a very clear example of that principle. So that's the first important point I would want to get across, that all this is internally sensible. You are allowed to sit at the front if you wish. It's tough. So it's rather sort of difficult to know where to start, because it's all interactive. You could start at any of these levels and everything connects with it. But shall we start at the top? With the anatomy of the menstrual cycle. So on day one, after as the bleed starts, the first movement occurs up here with a stimulation of growth in what will become the follicle. So the first movements of that ovum begin to happen, and it starts developing. It develops because, of course, there is follicle stimulating hormone, which is here, the green line on this chart. That begins to rise, not to huge levels, but as that, in this first stage, there is a doubling or so in the levels of FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. And that's the main effect of FSH is to increase the activity of this structure. It becomes multiple cells. It starts off with a very small number of cells, and then it begins to grow. And as it begins to grow, it begins to produce hormones. So the FSH creates, in effect, a new endocrine gland. Yeah. And the hormones are particularly the estrogen estradiol. So as this structure develops, it begins to increase the levels of hormones, which of course course through the whole body. The effect of the hormones, as we'll see, is to have a number of other consequences, but let's just stay with this for the moment. As it grows, it begins, like most structures which grow beyond a certain point, they can't maintain the solid mass anymore, so they begin to empty out in the middle. So you get a follicle form, and there's a fluid-filled space here, which is, this is important because could be the beginning of a cyst, if this wasn't realized, but you can see there is a cyst forming here. So it greatly increases in size and becomes visible to the naked eye at this point. But it's still constantly pumping out hormones, and you can see that the estrogens are beginning to get to a pretty high peak here. What they do, estrogens begin to suppress the FSH levels, but a new kid on the block, again from the anterior pituitary, starts picking up on this. There is also a gradual increase in progesterone production, but from a low base. The increasingly high estrogen plus the high progesterone leads to a suppression in the FSH production, but suddenly a remarkable increase in LH production, which is most important production. And this is a direct consequence of the concentrations of this. What this chart doesn't show is that there's also an increase in androgens beginning to pick up. So there's a new cocktail of hormones which acts, first of all, to suppress particularly FSH production, but then you get this positive feedback loop. Most hormone control is negative feedback, isn't it? So you produce more thyroid, and it basically switches off more thyroid production. It's a simple control loop, and that's how you manage internally your hormone production. But here we flip from a negative feedback loop, which you see in effect in the suppression of FSH here. That's a classic negative feedback effect. But there comes a point where you break out, and the effect of the very high levels of estrogen leads to a sudden surge of luteinizing hormone. It shoots up. That in turn has a positive feedback effect on the FSH production, and you get a combination peak of these two pituitary hormones, the LH taking very much the lead at this point. See what happens with the LH peak? It suppresses markedly the estrogen levels, which drop. The combination of this very high level of LH, very high levels of FSH comparatively, and a drop in estradiol breaks open the body, and that is your ovulation. All right so far? So you can see that there's an interplay, isn't there? There's a choreography. This is a choreography. And actually when you break this out, it does it head in. The interactions going on are multiple that make Rubik's Cube seem like a very shallow device. Altogether, this is a four-dimensional Rubik's Cube. It's 3 dimensions plus time. This is an extraordinary complex thing. And keep coming back to this. If you try to break it out, it'll do your head in. But it doesn't need breaking out because it is self-organizing. Just leave it, and it's its own internal choreography. Time after time it delivers. So ovulation occurs, the ovum breaks out from the follicle, and at that point, of course, you can have a potential conception. The rest of the cycle is all about the prospect of you getting a conception and implantation. This structure that's left behind after the ovulation clumps up as the yellow body, the corpus luteum, and that is very visible to the naked eye. That's a yellow speck. And its main job is to be a hormonal, temporary endocrine gland. And its main purpose is to prepare the womb for a future pregnancy. The first effect is to lead to a massive surge in progesterone levels, the effect of which, and a secondary surge in estradiol, the effect of that combination is to markedly switch back to the negative feedback loop here, which should have been, which is the normal mechanism to completely drive down the LH and FSH production, so that during the rest of the cycle, the pituitary takes a backseat. It's being held down by this surge of hormones. And without a pregnancy, the corpus luteum on average functions for about 10 days at full tilt. So that's shown here. We've got the days somewhere down here. It's 14 years, 28. So at about day 24, we begin to see a drop in progesterone production and estrogen production with a decline in the structure itself, so it actually dries up and becomes a white body called this albicamus, and diminishes to what is effectively a mini scar. We can find all the old corpus here in an ovary on autopsy. They're tiny specks, but you can see how you can count them if you really wanted to be nerdish, and how many cycles there have been simply by the number of these little white specks. Because they no longer function, the endocrine functions are only the same days or so, unless there is a process, in which case the corpus luteum is maintained for 2 to 3 months. It retains its role as a hormone producer to allow the time for the placenta to build and to become its own endocrine. So it acts as a stopgap to the placenta, and the rest of the hormone functions associated with pregnancy can switch in. The drop in progesterone levels is, of course, the key last stage of the cycle. To see what happens, let us look at what's happening here. This is the endometrial lining. And of course, in the first few days, it is sloughing off. That's the bleed. So, I mean, however many days it does vary also. But let's say 4 or 5 days. You're bleeding. And then, as a result of particularly the estrogen rise here, but also the rise in follicle-stimulating hormone, you get a build-up of the endometrial lining. So that by the time ovulation has occurred, it is ripe and ready to hold the implanted embryo at conception. And in the expectation that will occur, it builds up to its richest levels in that first 10 days after the ovulation. So at this point, it is extremely vascular. There's a lot of blood, new blood cells, new blood vessels, obviously, formed all under the influence increasingly of these two hormones, progesterone and estrogen. And of course, there's no mystery about it. It's the sudden drop of that, induced by the phased, programmed death, if you like, of the corpus luteum. Sudden drop leads to the breakdown of the endometrial lining in the next cycle. Body temperature, which is one of the best ways of monitoring these events externally, varies by about a degree, on average within a degree, so it tends to stay low in the follicular stage of the cycle, and there's a small peak. Actually, what you often get is a drop back down, but at the time of ovulation, you'll go half a degree or more up, and it either stays up for a while or drops down. Very often it stays up at a high level until you get to the point of the drop. Nothing very new in all that. Just homework. No revision, I mean. Okay. Any questions that you've picked up on this so far? Any things you were worried about, couldn't quite get your head around? I haven't put in the androgens, but they also tend to have mini versions of these peaks here. And we mustn't overlook them because they have a significant role to play, particularly in terms of evolution. Rory thinks that there is an advantage in becoming receptive, if you like, to sexual activity around this time. The androgen levels, which tend to drive it, tend to also peak around this time. It's a secondary peak, lower peak, in the second half, the luteal phase. And the androgen very neat way of just getting this image of the menstrual cycle in your head. Okay? So it says 28 days, but of course it does vary, doesn't it? The normal range is between 24 and say 32, 33, so there's a sort of 5-day wiggle room that's quite in the normal range. On the whole, the follicular stage is the most stable, tends to be 14 days. It's the luteal phase that tends to vary. And many will know that that comes with potential consequences. It's this drop in progesterone that causes quite a lot of trouble in the last few days of the cycle. And if the luteal phase is extended, this drop, or the relative drop, can also seem longer. And tends to be that the longer cycles tend to have more prevalence of premenstrual syndrome of one sort or another, which is where this drop becomes significant. We're showing here a nice neat fall in progesterone levels just before the 28 days and the start of the bleed. But if the corpus luteum, for example, isn't quite pulling its weight, it can start fading before the 10 days, and you can start getting drops of progesterone levels before they're due. And that, particularly if you're getting other hormonal disruptions going on, dopamine, for example, serotonin, are key players in how you feel at that point. And sometimes, and prolactin's the other player on this block. Changes in this and the corpus luteum secretions can upset and exacerbate changes in other hormones, so that you can get increasingly disruptions of mood, for example, as well as water retention. We're all familiar with the things that can go wrong in the last few days of the cycle. That is a multi-hormonal phenomenon, but it's driven very largely by the health of this particular body. So, shall we look at some disruptions in menstrual cycle and look at some of the ways in which, for example, as herbal practitioners address them. So let's take the periods themselves as a start. They can be painful. They can be unpleasant. And there are essentially two main ways in which they can happen. The first periods, particularly in teens, can be very sharply painful, and most girls know about that, and sometimes distressingly so. Time off school, lots of painkillers, lots of hot water bottles, other ways of just managing it. That's called spasmodic dysmenorrhea. So dysmenorrhea is pain of bleeding. Spasmodic is the, if you like, the first type of painful periods, and it occurs usually, the first cycles are often anovulatory. In other words, there isn't an ovulation. They don't quite kick up that degree, so they're sort of first runs, if you like, before the ovulation, before this kicks in. So there's not enough hormones produced, for example, to get the follicle developed. You don't get to that stage you can again sometimes see that there was a follicle development, and you can sometimes see an undeveloped follicle on autopsy of a cycle that didn't lead to full ovulation. But if you don't get the full ovulation, you don't get the surge in hormones. For some reason, you don't get spasmodic dysmenorrhea. So most of the very early, doesn't always happen, but most girls have a few cycles which are not don't lead to ovulation. They don't tend to get the pain. And as soon as ovulation starts happening, then you start looking at the spasmodic dysmenorrhea as quite a common feature. It affects more girls than not. The best way of understanding spasmodic dysmenorrhea is by understanding the pain of angina. Do you know what I mean by that pain? What is angina caused by? Ischemia, contraction of blood vessels, loss of oxygen to the muscle of the heart in this case. Well, the heart muscle is different from the womb, but there are similarities. One, of course, is defined very much by its neuromuscular properties. You know, the cardiac muscle is almost a cross between a muscle and a nerve fibre. It's got its own contractility. The womb has comparable muscle cells, but they're much more hormonally responsive. But they both share one feature in common, is that when you reduce the oxygen supply, they get sore, real sore. And this pain of spasmodic dysmenorrhea is very comparable to the pain of angina because it's caused by effectively the same thing, loss of blood supply to the muscle. And that's because, in effect, the uterine muscle has cramped. It gets into spasm and simply squeezes the blood supply. So when gynecologists, who are often blokes, treat, or used to treat spasmodic dysmenorrhea, what did they often do when it was really acute? The standard surgical intervention was not surgical, but medical intervention in spasmodic dysmenorrhea was dilation. You actually put an implement into the cervix and stretch it, simply to prevent that cramping. Just open up, and sometimes it works. It's got sort of intrusive qualities about it, but you know, to be fair, there were many girls at the time who were grateful to be relieved of what sometimes, well, if you two may know from your own experience, can be really distressing pain. But that's an illustration of the principle that it's cramping of the muscle that leads to that sort of period pain. Of course, the natural version of dilation is pregnancy. The effect of having a birth through the cervix, birth canal dilation, means that mostly you don't get spasmodic dysmenorrhea after pregnancy. You can get another type that will come on to in a moment. So it's very much a young womb problem, if you can see what I'm saying. It's a new womb. There's one that is still unstretched, dare I put it, then you get that cramping and get that cramping effect. The way that women worked it out for themselves, you just need to pause here to remember that most herbalists were women, so join the club. This has always been women's work. It's the thing that they seem to have done in almost every culture around the world. And a large part of what they did was to look after their own needs. So most wise women, or whatever we might call them in the community, were also the midwives and dwellers, and people looked after children as well as after their own health. And it's also worth remembering that unfortunately, for much of history, a woman who, for example, could not have children was devalued socially. It was a harsh environment for women for much of human history. And so the imperative, for example, when you couldn't conceive, to find things that would help you conceive was sometimes extraordinarily powerful. Women would rarely need to find something if they were infertile. Infertility, I'm just jumping ahead of it, is in effect a menstrual cycle that is not clicking as it should. Or there may be some problem, of course, with implantation at the womb lining level. But just for the purposes of improving fertility alone, women would really stretch their intuitive faculties to the limit to find the parts to get this cycle running. So we have some extraordinary, powerful women's remedies to learn about as herbalists, and we'll come back to some of the other ones later. But just back to the spasmodic dysmenorrhea, the main way in which women would approach that would be with relaxants, things that would relax that spasm in the womb. And every culture had their own version of them. But the ones that we find most effective are the ones developed by probably the world's specialists in women's medicine, the Native Americans. Whether they were blessed with good fortune with the herbs they had or with other intuitive insights, we don't know. But there's no doubt that the best remedies that I know of are Native American remedies. And there are two which stand out for spasmodic dysmenorrhea. They're both viburnums. Viburnum opulus, the craft bark name rather gives it away, doesn't it? And Viburnum prunifolium, which has the unfortunate English name Black Hawk, H-A-W. So you have to spell that quickly. But the Viburnum prunifolium and Viburnum opulus are the two that were most often used or chosen by women for this. There are others, remedies, which they chose, squalvine, which are repellents, bethroot, trillium, various species of trillium, pendulum, erectum, and what's the other one I'm trying to remember? Trillium. Oh, and blue cohosh, colophon, Thalictroides, the blue cohosh, were used all for reducing spasm in the womb. The other thing, of course, that most women find who have this pain is that a hot water bottle does help. And the reason for that is obvious. We just said that the main reason for the pain is the loss of oxygen, loss of blood to the womb, and just putting a hot water bottle helps to counteract that. But you can do that internally, can't you, with your warming remedies. So ginger is an old remedy that women used a lot for this sort of menstrual spasm. there's others. Actually, the best, let's say it quickly, the best guide is the Johnson Bone book, which has a chapter on this with a whole range of these herbs. So go read. There's actually a pretty good chapter. It's actually written by a couple of blokes. There's a whole range of pretty useful herbs in there that have been sort of pulled out of various traditions around the world. They include the Shatavari Indian remedy, which is coming back around as one of the standard treatments for all sorts of menstrual problems. It's not Shatavari, by the way. It's like people call it. It's Shatavari. It's got a long A. The second A is long, which is an asparagus, isn't it? It's asparagus plant, same genus as our asparagus vegetable, and the Chinese have a version of asparagus as well. But Shatavari is a classic stabilising remedy across the whole menstrual cycle, which we'll return to. So that's spasmodic dysmenorrhea, but the second one is the congestive one. And that tends to happen later. It's particularly likely to happen with women who have had babies, women who are older, and this is the key point, it's most associated with premenstrual congestion. To the extent that it's sometimes very difficult to separate a congestive dysmenorrhea from a premenstrual syndrome, particularly if there's fluid retention and related changes. We're definitely talking about a complex hormonal disruption when we're dealing with congestive dysmenorrhea on the one hand, but this is important. We're also talking about a pelvic phenomenon. And we have the unfortunate legacy of having invented chairs on which your bum is now sitting. Think about it. You're now creating in your pelvis a sump, a bucket in which fluids, lymph, blood, and other fluids sit, literally sit. That was not what nature intended. Chairs came late in human evolution. We used to squat, sit on the floor, stand, and above all walk. So the average hunter nomad, male and female, would often walk 30 to 40 miles a day. Kilometres, that's, just work it out, 40 to 50 more kilometres a day. That's a long way to go, isn't it? How far is Hamilton away? That's the normal mileage of humans, simply because they needed to survive. So we were designed on our feet, almost literally, and sitting down in this position, L-shaped position, is new. And it has meant that we are all suffering in one way or another from pelvic congestion as a result of that. Pelvis was not meant to be a sump. It was meant to design for easy flow of blood and lymph. But it does have a slight engineering challenge because it has got a bottom to it. And the pelvis has got a floor. And a floor, two floors, a floor, R and AW. It really needs to be moving. It's in size, sort of like this. It's quite a small space, and there's a lot of stuff jammed in there. There's the bowels, there's the bladder, as well as the womb. And they're all crammed into that space. And because there's, obviously there are orifices at the bottom, but essentially this is a floor. And it means that to get lymph and blood up, you've got to have something to pull them up. There isn't a natural place for it to go unless you've got some pumping device, and the pumping is the muscles. And there's a lot of muscles, you know, if compared with the space here, the size of the glutes is twice that size or more. And all you need to do is to work the glutes and the muscles around it, and you're creating a vacuum pumping effect, which in natural terms is enough to keep the pelvis running smoothly. But as we sit here now, we are not. And we have created, if you like, a build-up of toxic lymphatic, particularly lymphatic build-up in this area. The lymphatics, as you may remember from your anatomy, are in this sort of like a cat's cradle, into a network of lymphatics. And so the veins are in the similar sort of there, and they easily pull up. Which means that for most women and men, who have their own pelvic problems, there is a toxic build-up, naturally, not naturally, but normally, to be factored in to the story. And congestive problems, congestive dysmenorrhea particularly, is undoubtedly largely led by the congestion that build up the toxins. So one of the important things we can recommend for someone who has got congestive problems, congestive dysmenorrhea particularly, but also congestive premenstrual patterns, is to get walking or pedaling. Pedaling is a good one. Get a bicycle machine if you can't face the roads. You know, just get something that's going to move those glutes. Or just slap some headphones on and rap and just go to the beat. But do something to get that blood moving through the pelvis. There's a very simple exercise you can do on a daily basis at home, which is simply lie down on the floor, get your legs up in the air and pedal upside down. When you think about it, you're doing two things at once there, aren't you? Both pumping, but also you're getting gravity moving in the opposite direction for once. And a minute or three of that will do a lot to clean up a congested pelvis on a daily basis. So that's one very important point that you can spend quite some time talking with your patients about just getting that pelvis working smoothly. But back to the hormones, as we said, the main factor in both premenstrual syndrome and congestive dysmenorrhea hormonally is this failure of corpus luteum. And it does seem that this is a pretty common problem. Corpus luteal insufficiency. Just don't quite get the full mileage out of that little body. It's just as well we've got a herb which is perfectly designed for corpus luteal insufficiency. And we're going to throw me a name? Vitex. You got it. Agnes castus. It's the go-to at this point, and it's not North American for once, it's Mediterranean. And it's, we've got it out in the garden here, so you're probably familiar with the smell of it. And when you go to various Greek islands in late summer, the whole island is redolent of this smell. And some of us blokes sometimes think it's like walking into a woman's changing room. It's just got that very strong association with women, and that was always how it was seen in ancient Greek and Roman times. This was the archetypal woman's, and it was often sacred in women's temples as a favourite gynecological remedies. And it does have potentially these remarkable effects on this stage of the cycle. Maintain the corpus luteum and produce particularly that effect, the build-up effect at the end of the cycle. There are other approaches to dealing with that end of the cycle. You often point to various vitamin deficiencies, and particularly Bs, and particularly B6. The evidence is a little bit mixed, but there's at least good plausible reasons to double check that and to make sure that your A or Bs generally are up, but particularly the B6s within that complex. It's always better to give these things in their natural context, and Bs aren't very mentally separated. So I'm not a great fan of B6 on its own, because I think it's taken out of context. The Bs work as a family. So I would start with a general natural B vitamin complex supplement, but perhaps with B6 topping it up so that it's B6 heavy, because there does seem to be some rationale for that. So that's a thought. The other big thought around this stage of the cycle is your lipids, your omegas. There seems to be in some women particularly who get congestive problems and premenstrual problems, a failure to convert linoleic acid into prostaglandins. So you get the wrong sort of prostaglandins and the wrong sort of cramping and pain as a direct result of that. So topping up with certain types of omegas seems to be one other strategy, and the one that, of course, has always been used with is even primrose oil. There's a certain irony about even primrose oil, because it's actually a pretty expensive oil. If anyone's seen an evening primrose plant, you can see why there's not that many seeds in it. So whoever found it was onto a good one there. They could mint it, coin it. But you can get similar benefits from blackcurrant seed oil, for example, several of the other seed oils, safflower. They can all be used as alternatives. Again, it's worth using them in some quantity. Now, the point about the nutritional approaches is that they're only really relevant at the time. Both the conversion of fatty acids and the need for vitamins are short term. They've got a high turnover. And it's here that you need, if you need it, that's when you need it. It's not much point taking them at this stage of the cycle, because they simply get flushed out the other end. But towards the latter part of the cycle is the time that you will lay in. But to do it properly. So if you're needing, for example, eating primrose oil, I think the starting dose is 500 milligrams per day. And I would go higher, just to make the point. But you can save a lot of money by not taking them for most of the cycle. Just go from, say, just after ovulation onwards, so you can immediately halve your expense by just keeping it to that stage of the cycle. There are other issues around this. I mentioned the dopamine factor, because there's no doubt that depression particularly is a common company of this premenstrual syndrome. There's different types of premenstrual syndrome that are classified A, B, H, C, D, A, B, C, H. They're different descriptions of premenstrual syndrome you've probably seen. Again, they're in the book, Mills and Mills. They got different aspects and different hormonal factors behind them. But certainly, depression is a common accompaniment of the premenstrual syndrome, and sometimes very difficult to piece apart. The only way in which you can tell it's not generalized depression is because it tends to be at a certain time of the month. But the principles, the underlying phenomena are pretty similar. It's serotonin, dopamine disruption. And it seems as though that is compounded by this drop in progesterone levels. So there's some nefarious play going on here. But what it does mean is that you can genuinely step in at that point herbally with things that you might use for depression. And the standout herb chosen by women, and primarily as a woman's herb, incidentally, is hyperion. Hyperion was in Europe a woman's herb, used particularly, and we'll come on to that later, towards the end of the reproductive life, menopause. So it's a menopause tonic, but it can be a very useful premenstrual remedy as well, because it seems somehow to play with that dopamine serotonin.
Sorry, can I just ask a very quick question about the hypericum? Would you tend, if it is, we're looking at the depression sort of picture, would you use that just in the luteal phase as well? You wouldn't need to have it the whole way through?
Yeah. I think the point about this cycle, I'm leaving this up, is because it does point to a phased approach. You know, you're a different being here, hormonally, than you are here. I live in a household of women. All my close relatives are women, so I'm sort of vicariously know this. You do change in just the way you jump at things at different times of the cycle, and that is a reflection of the way in which someone plays these games. So there's no point, really, in dealing with the problem here by taking something there. There is an exception to this, which is that you might conclude that this problem here is part of a bigger cyclical issue. So let's say that one of the things you've learnt from your history is that the period is very variable. You might have between 3 and 6 weeks between bleeds. And that tells us that there's a much wider issue in which almost always the premenstrual problems are compounded with these long variable cycles. So you might want to deal with the premenstrual problems, which can sometimes go on for a couple of weeks, not by just treating it there, but by treating the whole cycle as a self-organizing thing. You want to click the cycle back. And that's where I'm coming to next. The idea that this is, as I said at the beginning, a self-organizing entity which runs itself if it is running at remarkable regularity. But if it isn't running, then we need to give it that nudge. And there are remedies which women found mainly to improve their fertility, because that was the driving pressure behind all this. But also, as we'll see, for other reasons as well, but there were herbs that come through in each culture as the ones that women would use, not because they were told a fine story, but because they damn well needed it. And in India it was shatavari. It turned out that was the woman's first choice to to improve fertility, but that meant improving the whole menstrual cycle. So in that sense, because infertility is often a failure of the whole thing to click. So Shatavari, in the case of Native Americans, Agnes castus was the most popular remedy for fertility in the Mediterranean. And the most popular remedy in Native America is unfortunately no longer free and available. I say unfortunately because it is dramatic in its benefits, and that's Helonius root, false unicorn root. Camillirium is the better name, Camillirium luteum. Now, I'm putting that up not because I think you can use it at the moment, because it is almost, well, it is endangered in the wild. Most of it is still wild crafted. The most sustainable sourcing, there's still attempts to grow commercially which are not quite there yet. But at the moment the most sustainable sourcing is when they put roads through the habitats, and you get plant hunters going in ahead of the road crews and just picking up all the Camelarium and other black cohosh and all the other things they find that are otherwise going to be destroyed. But it's a bit of a tenuous thing, and you can't really separate that crop from people just going in and ravaging the Appalachians, which is where this mostly grows. So reluctantly we have stopped using it, and it is really reluctantly. And I'm afraid actually I have a personal sense of guilt here, because in my very first book, Out of the Earth, I reflected how wonderful this was, and a lot of Americans were using that book, and it became part of a problem, which I now regret. But so I'm telling you about it simply, A, because it is amazing, B, one day we may get sustainable sourcing, so keep a watch out for genuinely sustainable sourcing of Helonius root is the other name. That was widely described in the eclectic and other literature of the 19th century as a herb which had a health warning by it. Women should not take it unless they wanted to be pregnant. You know, that was almost serious, but its reputation for improving fertility was unparalleled. So it's an interesting point. Why, how could it be so significant in its effect? It contains saponins. Remember them? The steroids, plant steroids. If you've ever heard me talk about plant research, you know that I've talked about saponins quite a lot. Other remedies that contain saponins are ginseng, for example, licorice, another example, astragalus. Lots of the old tonic remedies have steroids in them, natural steroids. And the view is that they work, when they do work, by modulating your body's steroid functions. The menstrual cycle is dominated by steroids. It's the steroids. And their production and their management is a very fine-tuned feedback loop, as we've seen. We think that remedies that work, like Camillirium work by modulating the responses of particular estrogen production. So before we ran out of opportunities to explore it, our view was that this was working particularly on the follicular stage of the cycle, leading to the prime position for ovulation to occur and hence fertility to occur. But the consequence was that you got a regulation of the menstrual cycle overall. Now there are other hormones which do this, but I just want to stick with this because as an example, it's sort of like the prime example of what you might expect in practice. So you've got a client or a patient who's, for one reason or another, getting irregular menstrual cycles, and for one reason or another, it could be because they're getting dysmenorrhea, digestion, or it could be because they want children. You want to click that back. Remember I said at the beginning, this is self-organizing. So we're not manipulating, we're not giving them hormones as such to manipulate. We want to just knock it into normal function. So the classic response, and you do get this with other remedies as well, but you particularly used to see this with Camellia, is that you almost reliably predict this is going to take 3 cycles. So you would find when their next period was due and get it set up so that they were taking your herbs at the first day of that cycle. And then you would reliably predict that the first period after that, a month or cycle later, would be unusual. And you could not predict how unusual it was. You just say, this is going to be different. You may get nails, you may get clean, but just check the pregnancy or whatever it is if you need to worry about that. You know, it's quite common you wouldn't miss it. We might get 17 minutes. The periods might be more cramping or less cramping. Whatever it is, it's likely to be different. And in fact, you know what? The more different, the better. Because it's, and we can now call it a reboot, because now we can use computing language here. Because this is, the menstrual cycle is like a program in a computer. Sometimes it gets conflicted by the program doing what you do, close it down, count to 10, and restart it, reboot it, and hopefully click back. That's what we're looking at. And the first period after you start treatment is almost, if you're on track, will be different. And you just hope it's not too uncomfortable, and you might have to give things just to reduce some of the discomfort. But you can reassure them that that means we're on track. Because the cycle after that, usually, it's already looking better. And by the 3rd cycle, you're beginning to see a normal, rebooted cycle. And this is the point. At that point, you stop. Because it's back. The click is back. You don't need to do any more. And time and again, this is what we saw in this sort of approach. You only needed to do it until the thing was running itself, self-organizing itself, and then leave it. And there are 14 herbal babies in Exeter, women who were otherwise unable to conceive, who as a result of this sort of approach have. And it's one of those more warming results of in practice that you can actually see that. And as I think I said before, we even had my first herbal grandchild. In other words, a child born to somebody who was conceived after having had a herbal treatment. So that's, if you like, the ideal that this represents, and we do hope that it will come back into some sort of sustainable production. If anyone's looking online to see, do let me know if there's any updates on this. But last I heard that it was still a bit dodgy, and the reality is that at home we've stopped asking for it. We don't want our suppliers to go getting it if it's some dodgy sourcing. There are other remedies. You see, Shatavari has also got saplings in. So I'm putting Shatavari up, and I use Shatavari in my own practice as an alternate to Camellia. Squall-vine, Machella repens is one that seems to work in this area, and although it works in a different part of the cycle, Agnus castris is still likely to help get that rebooting happening. All right, I think we're coming to a natural pause because I then want to look at some of the other problems that can occur, but I just wanted to stay with, make sure we've covered most of the menstrual cycle things in themselves. What have I missed out? Excessive, yeah, I'll leave excessive bleeding until afterwards because it usually picks up on other things that can go wrong. Anything that you're picking up that we just need to address?
What about short cycles or missed cycles?
Missed cycles is a good one, yeah. So when you have amenorrhea, as they call it, which means you're missing cycles, that's a good point, thank you. We are used to having a cycle every month, but that is itself a mark of relative affluence. A hunter nomadic woman, someone calculated, would have less periods in their life than the fingers on their hands for a number of reasons. First of all, through many parts of the year they were not getting enough nourishment. And as you may know, if you're in fasting or a dieting, extreme dieting, or of course an anorexic phase, you tend not to have cycles. And that's a normal evolutionary adjustment. So a woman who's going through a lean phase, there's not enough food around, it's not a good time to have babies, so they simply switch off that function. So for many women living that close to nature, there might only be a couple of times in the year when they're back to normal ovulatory function. Then they would get pregnant quite readily, and of course once they were pregnant, there were obviously no periods then, but when the baby came, they would suckle the baby on demand for anything up to 3 years. And that itself would suppress ovulation. So high prolactin levels associated with breastfeeding tend to suppress the cycle. So when you add those together and the slightly shorter lifespan of women anyway in that environment, you reduce remarkably the number of periods you're going to get. The point there is that in effect, by having regular cycles, we're already slightly unnatural in that evolutionary context. And it shows, it's a simple reflection of how relatively well nourished we are and how available food is that we can have for regular ovulations. So amenorrhea is in a sense, in some ways, a kickback to times when life was harder. We often associate it with women, for example, who are working extreme exercise, fit athletics, especially when they're younger, intense training will tend to suppress periods. Eating problems obviously will. And it can happen through a number of other factors that affect general health and well-being. I think there's just a little slight detour here before we break, because it also reflects on what might happen later on in the menopause. The ovaries and indeed the testes, are one of only 2 glands that produce steroids. What's the other one, you know? Top of your head?
Adrenals.
Adrenal
Cortex.
cortex. Well done. There is 2 adrenals.
They'll give me a lot.
Yeah,
You've been paying attention.
the adrenal cortex. So I'm going to tell you a little story when I was in the States and working with some really exciting people over there. One was Michael Cohen, who was a specialist in fertility from the male side. And we were talking about the Chinese kidney. The kidney as used in TCM, Chinese medicine, you probably know that's not the same as the kidneys that we have as your battery, isn't it? It's your powerhouse, it's your source of the energies. And we were looking for a physiological correlation to the kidneys in China. And we'd already figured out that actually the adrenal cortex was pretty close in terms of the behaviour and the way you understand it, particularly the idea of general adaptation to stress, you know, which is an adrenal role, which is very similar to how the Chinese viewed kidneys. But the Chinese also included in kidneys reproductive health. And Richard and I, who were having a good evening together, and got through the second bottle, I think, were beginning to wander slightly and reminded ourselves of embryology. Because there is something called the primary kidney in the embryo. Sometimes also referred to as the genital ridge. But it's a little ridge which is at the back of what will become the abdomen in the adult, just here, which forms that before the kidneys as we understand them develop. And this genital ridge or primary kidney changes to become the adrenal cortex and the gonads. So they come from the same root. Very interestingly, this is where the kidney meridian runs down, exactly on that point. So we came up to the conclusion that the Chinese kidney was the genital ridge in the embryo, and it encompasses all those joint functions of the adrenals, cortex, and the, in your case, the ovaries. This, I'm just going to jump ahead, leads to one remarkable thought, which is borne out consistently by experience. Think about what happens at the menopause. At the menopause, up till the menopause, your 2 steroid-producing glands, as women, are functioning as a team. They actually overlap. They each produce sex hormones. They each produce sex hormones, so they do overlap. But at menopause, one pair says, bye, I'm off. It's over to you. So a very simple, quick distinction between a woman who sails through the menopause, and many do. We think of menopause as a problem, but it ain't for a good, perhaps historically the majority of women would not have a problem with menopause. Time and again I've talked to an 85-year-old or a 75-year-old woman and say, can you remember your menopause? And they say, oh, I just stopped buying tampons. You know, that was the menopause. And that shows that that's what it should be. But a woman who can sail through the menopause, effectively is good adrenals. And vice versa. So that leads on, jumping ahead a bit, but it's sort of a segue from this, that we can see the hormonal apparatus behind all of this. It's very close to that Chinese kidney, otherwise the joint team operation between the ovaries and the adrenal cortex. And we could approach disruptions in the menstrual cycle also by bringing the adrenal cortex into play and treat the disruptions with adrenal tonics as well as narrowly menstrual female remedies. So to add to the mix of things that you might consider if you're dealing with a disruption in the cycle, you might, if your patient's story points in that direction with hints of adrenal exhaustion, stress overload, whatever, depletion of one sort or another, throw in some of those adrenal tonics. So amenorrhea was your question. Amenorrhea is often associated with that short-term, hopefully, stress burden. Sometimes if it's an issue that you want to fix, sometimes it sorts itself out. If it's an issue that wants to be fixed, and you've moved aside from whatever anorexic or other problems there might be, you might also see that as an indication for adrenal support. Okay, for a break. We'll look at some problems, other problems afterwards. Good, let's pick it up. I want to just move on to other sort of more overt pathological problems that can affect menstrual functions and reproductive functions of women. And it probably helps just to have a look at a few more gross pictures, just to remind ourselves of what things look like in there and how that affects our calculations in putting plans together. We all know what this is, so but essentially it's looking at how the various structures are arranged and how they can become effective. The obvious points here are that the interior of the womb is actually open to the abdominal cavity through the end of the fallopian tube here. So it's almost like there's a free access from anything within the abdominal cavity into the fallopian tube and womb, and of course vice versa. Anyone know what are the most obvious consequences of that in terms of one of the common pathologies of the human body? A longish name based on the tissue that lines the womb. Sorry?
Retrograde menstruation.
No, I'm looking for one word. Endometriosis. Does that mean anything to you?
Didn't get it.
It's a toughie, actually. I mean, it has a number of consequences of what endometriosis is actually, a number of causes, so, but what endometriosis actually is endometrial lining, but not in the endometrium. And endometriosis can involve endometrial lining and bleeding anywhere in the abdominal cavity. And it could be that in fetal development there was just a misplacement of tissue, but a common consequence is simply migration of endometrial tissue out into the abdominal cavity, and you can have little spots of it almost anywhere, on the bowel wall, on the bladder wall, on the wall, the peritoneal cavity. It can be spots, it can be larger areas, and you can get, in effect, inflammatory activity, pain particularly associated with that ripening at the same time as the endometrial lining is, in other words, the middle to second, third of the cycle. And then when you have the bleed, you also have bleed from those other tissues. So in effect you get symptoms of inflammatory disease, pelvic inflammatory disease particularly. So I just wanted to touch on PID as a concept. Because endometriosis is one cause, but of course the most common cause of pelvic inflammatory disease is an infection that has become established in the pelvis. And the routes to that infection are fairly obvious, because again there's another route of entry to the exterior here, and infections are still the most common cause of pelvic inflammatory disease, particularly venereal infections. Chlamydia and gonorrhea are the two most common causes of pelvic inflammatory disease, but it could be a trauma, an abortion for example, or some other intrusion or damage, or could be surgical or other intrusion to the pelvic cavity. And it's that something I was talking about earlier. It's so easy for an infection to bed in the pelvic area. And it's very hard for conventional treatment to get to. So the pelvic inflammatory or infections associated with pelvic inflammatory disease are pretty resistant to anti-antibiotics. They are rather challenging, to put it mildly. So we do get PID quite often in our practice because of the fact that it's so hard to treat. And even though the original cause, the infection or whatever it is, might be a long time ago, the results still linger on. The main symptoms of inflammatory problems in the pelvis are very painful. Bleeds, tenderness in the area, and an indelicate point here, but there's a technical name to cover your back. It's called dyspareunia. Which means pain on deep penetration, which is most often associated with sexual intercourse. But even inserting tampons, for example, can be acutely painful. So it is simply the fact that this whole area becomes inflamed. And it is accompanied almost always by this congestion I talked about earlier. So our way of managing this congestive inflammatory problem is by working primarily on pelvic health. And it's the thing that drives it more than anything else. That's what I was saying earlier about getting the blood moving through this area. For heaven's sake, get pumping with those glutes. Get the blood coursing through the area. Do the pelvic floor exercises that expectant mothers get to learn about. We contract the pelvic floor and do particular exercises to get again the tone and the lymph moving in the area. Whatever you do, that needs to be the locomotive. You've got to get the blood moving through there. You need to find other ways of improving circulation, which could include the gingers and the other warming spices that you can put into your formulations. There is a Chinese remedy, which I haven't mentioned yet, but which is sometimes particularly associated with congestion and excessive blood, if you like, in the area, particularly around menstruation, and it's Dong Quai, which is Angelica sinensis, the Chinese Angelica, very much touted as a popular female remedy, but its main strength is in getting blood moving into this area. But you could use almost any circulatory remedy if it's appropriate. You know, the hawthorns, the horse chestnut, butcher's broom, those sort of remedies that have a wider circulatory function can all be used to help drive circulatory improvement in this area. So one thing that you don't get in conventional medicine, attention to that basic, if you like, pelvic hygiene idea. You've just got to get the blood and the fluids moving in the area. Turn it from being a sump into a flowing stream. It's a good image, actually. If you see a puddle or oxbow in a river or something where the water has turned brackish, there's two ways of dealing with that, isn't it? One is to drop a bottle of disinfectant in, clean the water, which is the equivalent of giving an antibiotic. Just kill whatever is in there. The other is to simply tap it into the flow of the river, and then it cleans itself. So the notion that we're dealing with here is to get the pelvis flowing. The only way you can do that is through working those muscles. And then on the back of that, having established that and really driving this home, you're not going to get this better unless you do a daily routine that involves pedaling or walking or even running. But pedaling is probably the best. And that upside down pedaling on a daily basis is a pretty useful way of doing it too. Only then can you then start thinking usefully about other things to do. And echinacea really has a lot to play here. This is a good indication for quite high doses of good quality echinacea to drive improvement. Bacteria, the other Native American remedy for inflammatory and infective conditions, is another one to consider. I used to use Helonius root quite often in combination with that, but we backed off there. But Dong Quai, definitely a good substitute. And the other ones, the Native American ones that really work up here are Beth root, which is Trillium, which is mostly used by, is the other name for Beth root, birth root, so it's mostly used around label, but doesn't come into its own in these congestive inflammatory conditions. Blue cohosh, a very valuable remedy for this coophyllum. And black cohosh. Both cohoshes for principally women. Black cohosh has this particular relevance to inflammatory problems that was primarily used for inflammatory conditions. And the final Native American remedy that plays in here, very powerful one, but very badly used, is wild yam. Dioscorea. People use it as a progesterone hormonal remedy. Bullshit. It is one of the best remedies for reducing spasm in the bowel and the pelvic contents. It's got saponins in it, but that's not the same as having direct hormonal properties. People got confused because wild yam was the original source of the contraceptive pill. But to make the pill, they had to zap the saponins in the yam. It doesn't come through when you take the natural product, but is a very powerful remedy for spasm and to some extent inflammation in any of the pelvic contents. And while I'm talking pelvis, quite a lot of confusion has arisen around the fact that when your womb gets into a state of anxiety, shall we say, pain and spasm, so often does your bowel. And gynecologists have forever lamented the fact that it's almost impossible to distinguish IBS type patterns from womb patterns. And they do often clamp together so that they're almost indistinguishable. So you can find that you get, IBS is such a nonsense word. It's basically a very large basket into which lots of stuff is thrown. But patients like it because it gives a vague problem a name. I've got IBS, and oh God, what have we really got here? There's your immediate follow-up question. And you say you park it and come back and find out what really is going on. There's about 27 different types of conditions that come into that category. But one of them could be a hormonally driven inflammatory problem that primarily originated here, which has led to inflammatory symptoms, congestive symptoms, affecting your periods and such like. Infection and inflammation in this area, of course, because of the way these organs are connected, have different manifestations. So you can have your inflammation confined to the cervix, and you can have various types of problems associated with that, often leading to the skin here is actually closer to the skin of your exterior, your fingers. This stuff is designed for dealing with insertions. But at the edge where the external skin, where the tough skin turns into endometrium, there's a sort of a fragile zone, which is where you can get dyscrasia. You can get the beginnings of cells going awry. And cervical erosion tends to occur at the junction between those two types of tissue. And that can lead to an inflammatory cervicitis, can actually be restricted to the cervix. Often actually treated simply with an external application, vaginal application. Come back to that in a moment. But then you get endometritis, which is inflammation of the endometrial lining, and then inflammation of the fallopian tubes, otherwise known as salpingitis. And this is dangerous. Why is this dangerous?
You can get scar tissue and then your tubes are blocked.
It's a major cause of infertility, because this is quite a narrow passage, isn't it? So it doesn't take that much inflammatory change, particularly long term, to begin to threaten the patency of this tube. And then of course you can get oophilitis, which is inflammation of the ovaries, moving around from an external infection transmitted through the passages. So it could be that your pelvic inflammatory condition is localized to salpinges, fallopian tubes, or the ovaries, and it could be one-sided. So I mentioned a couple of the symptoms of pelvic inflammatory disease, including dyspareunia, which is tenderness generally, but there's also a well-known phenomenon which has a German name, which is associated particularly with salpingitis and ophilitis, which is called Mittelschmerz. Because it's German, it's got a capital M, because they always have capital letters for their nouns. Mittelschmerz, which means pain in the middle. Schmerz is pain. What you're looking for is any hint of tenderness, particularly around ovulation, Mittelschmerz, middle of the month. When you have that luteal surge, we talked about luteal hormone surge, then you can get quite significant spasm of the fallopian tube muscle, which if it's inflamed, hurts. But it will hurt on one side. And if it's affecting the ovary, ovaritis, it will only hurt on the side when that ovary is the one that's producing the follicle. Because it's one at a time, isn't it? Do they alternate? No. They don't. They toss a coin. They don't actually toss a coin. But essentially, at the beginning of the month, they both go for it. And one gets to go. We don't know exactly how that coin is called. So what it means is that on average, you'll get 50% of your ovulations on right and left side, but you can't expect it to be each month is a toss-up. So you could get 2 or 3 months with one side, and then several months without, or they could be alternating, or it could be anything. But it does, having Mittelschmerz on one side is a very big clue, because then it tells you which side is ovulating that month. And if it's the bad side, then there's a much higher chance that you're not going to be fertile that month. If you get a cycle without Mittelschmerz and you're trying for a baby, that's the one to have the candlelit dinners and the baths and holidayettes, because that's when you're most likely to be fertile. So that's just an interesting observation. But Mittelschmerz can also be centralized. It's always a sign of pelvic inflammatory disease, pain in the middle of the month. It might be low level, but it's still important to pick it up in the consultation. Make sense? Just briefly on that, talking about using vaginal applications. The vagina, despite it being so open to the world, is actually a pretty ferocious barrier to things, and it does that because it produces an acidic environment, which is hostile to most things, including sperm. You know, it's a tough world if you're trying to get through the vagina, because it's the low pH actually prevents infection pretty well. If you have thrush, for example, which is a fungal infection of the vagina, it means your pH barrier has been compromised. The fungus does not thrive in a healthy vagina, nor does most infections. So the obvious point to make there is that if you want to get your defences back in shape, you want normal vaginal secretions. And those are estrogen dependent. So a common complaint, for example, in menopause, if an estrogen levels drop, is that you get drying of the vagina, atrophic vaginitis is this more medicalized term. But, you know, increasing discomfort, itchiness, all the rest of it, affecting the vagina. And you're looking for anything that will help to maintain, in effect, estrogenic activity in the area. But again, it's self-correcting. What it also suggests is that if you want to maintain vaginal health, you keep the application of acidity. So one of the oldest strips in the book was yogurt, which has its own natural low pH, is about the right level. In fact, the vagina, so to use that as a vehicle, it's bloody messy though. So you often look into something a bit cleaner. But the principle of not alkalizing the vagina is important. So you need to keep the acid levels up. You're not going to be wanting to put alcoholic tinctures there either. You don't need me to tell you that. So what you're looking for are things that you can apply in some aqueous form. One of the old, again, Native American remedies was thuja, the marble vitae, which was often used for vaginal applications. And again, you can make a reasonably good aqueous extract of that. Other people use tea tree oil, but keep it dilute. Actually, another very simple way of getting this area cleaned up is with salt water. Salt water. Sitzbath, or these days of plastic phobia, we've got another use for used squeezy bottles, which is as a douche. So get all the detergent out, please. But, once you've got that, then you've got a reasonably good douche applicator. And the simplest way is just to put warm, salty water at about the same level as seawater. Maybe a little saltier. It's a very good way of flushing through, cleaning up the area, and just preventing build-up of trouble in this area. All right. I've got another graphic anatomical picture, but again it shows some of the ways in which problems can build up in the pelvis when you look at it, a transection like this, and see how close organs are to each other here. This is something called the pouch of Douglas. Well, I suppose they've taken the guy out of it. They now call it a recto uterine pouch, but some bloke called Douglas put his name to it. So it used to be called the pouch of Douglas in my day. But look at it. There's trouble on legs, isn't it? That's a place where things can easily get built up. So if you've got any sort of abdominal inflammatory problem going on, a classic example is gallbladder problems, where you get, there's something called a paracolic gutter. It's a rather dramatic name given to the fact that the gallbladder's on the right-hand side. It's actually quite close. It's up here. But if there is any inflammation associated with gallbladder, cholecystitis, that reaches the external wall of that organ, then trouble can dribble down and get onto that right-hand side of the pelvic cavity. And if it builds up enough, so you've actually got a septic focus, that's where you're likely to find it, in that pouch, just because it's close. Other pressure problems, you can see that as the bladder fills up, it's going to be pushing against the wound here, so you can get, if that's inflamed with cystitis and urinary infections generally, that can lead to trouble. The big guy in the block, of course, is the bowel. It comes back to the point we were saying earlier about how complex it is to piece apart a bowel problem from a wound, simply because they're right next to each other.
I was just wondering about the effect of chicken and egg, increasing in the intestinal permeability because of something that might be a cause of any uterine problems.
Probably not directly, because if you've got leaky gut or whatever, the portal blood supply takes it away.
But with some of the cytokines and things.
Well, yeah, well, anything that involves inflammation
Yeah.
leads to build up of cytokines and various other inflammatory mediators, so you can get generalised symptoms simply as a result of that. But local transmission is more likely if there's inflammatory bowel disease. So if you've got Crohn's or particularly ulcerative colitis, ulcerative colitis is pretty much here. Diverticulitis, you know what that is? Yeah, some little pockets that inflamed, well that can be anywhere near here, couldn't it? So you're very close. So again, you can get an inflammatory condition of the bowel, in effect, being transmitted as a wound, or particularly here it is in South Indies.
Would that be the same with appendicitis as well, and possibly being
Yes.
particularly on the right side?
Yeah, the appendicitis.
Gallbladder related as well,
Yeah,
possibly.
exactly.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be long in the medical world to realise that the one thing they hate is what they call an acute abdomen, which is when someone's pulled in with blue lights flashing with extreme pains in this area, and it's almost impossible sometimes to identify what it is until you go in there. But the gallbladder is one example of a right-sided pain, and obviously appendix is the other. While we're at it, there is an old way of unravelling appendix problems. It comes from understanding the original embryonic position of these organs. Once upon a time we were a worm, very small, but still there. So we basically were a tube with a line, with a hose down the middle, just being as graphically as simple as I can. So all the organs that we now associate with being around in the abdomen originated in the middle, as did their nerve supply. So the classic movement of an appendix problem is because it originates from the endometrium, what am I talking about? The endoderm, the lining of the primitive gut. The first place that you feel the pain when it affects the inner lining of the appendix is midline. And then as the inflammation moves through the wall of the appendix and reaches the peritoneal outer membrane, it becomes localized. So typically the pain will start, and it's always a good idea when someone says they've got a dog pain to ask them to put their hand on it. And if it's the hand, then it's visceral, because it's pain. But if it's peritoneal, it's the finger. Yeah, got it? Yeah, because the visceral pain is referred from its original place in the midline. Even though it's actually here, you actually feel the pain on its original elevation pathway as a vague pain. But it becomes increasingly narrow as it moves to the peritoneum, and eventually you can put your finger on it, and then of course it becomes peritonitis, and that's where you start falling down dead. And that's why it's called acute abdomen, because they've got to move fast. But you can get the same thing with the gallbladder. Same thing, you get a pain originating in the centre. So gallbladder pain is usually midline, and you just think it's your stomach, but then it moves to the right, and actually the first way to do it is on the table and getting your fingers underneath the liver there, and asking to breathe in and out, and getting your fingers under the liver, and when the fingers touch the gallbladder, it's called Murphy's sign. But again, it's the peritoneal referral. Well, you get the same sort of thing affecting your fallopian tubes, not so much the ovaries. The ovaries are always localized. They get inflamed, and the place of feeling is just behind the pelvic bone here. And again, it's a question of breathing in and out and getting your fingers down in deep there, which you can do for yourself. But if you feel the tenderness there, then that's probably perforatis. simple application of anatomy, the way in which pain refers. But it can become a bloody confusion, literally, because there's so many factors that make it play. In a one-sided pain, particularly it's right-sided. On the left side, you've got all sorts of other players involved. Mostly it's the descending column as a confounding factor. Right, so it's a murky area, the pelvis, and the main antidote to murkiness is exercise and keeping the blood flowing, isn't it? Keep coming back to that, which the doctors won't tell you. They'll give you a hormone to suppress whatever it is going on. They're doing things differently. So again, just a reminder, uterine infections in women are a real confounding factor, and sometimes very difficult to tell them apart because they're very close to each other on the surface. And because once you get particularly interstitial cystitis, where the inflammation is deep in the tissues, particularly of the ureter here, or urethra, that is a chronic inflammatory condition, which again can be confused for a generalised pelvic inflammatory thing, but it can, because it's hormonal thing again, you can get exacerbations in a urinary condition around the time when you might expect exacerbations. Yeah. So let's have a look at another common problem that wounds are prey to, the fibroids. So we know what these are. They're hormone-dependent exaggerations, shall we say, of the normal muscle of the womb lining, womb wall. They are themselves hormone producers, so there's a lot of aromatase, which is the enzyme which precedes the production of estrogens. So they become themselves complicated in their own production. There's some link between fibroids and children, that there's a slight inverse relationship between having fibroids and children. In other words, if you don't have children, you're more likely to get fibroids. That's possibly because having children changes the hormonal undercurrents here, so that these things are more and less likely to happen. But it's not an overwhelming thing. We frankly don't know. However, in naturopathic and natural health terms, we can again bring back the bloody chairs. We are not having as much blood flow in this area, and these are, if you like, at the very least, signals of something not flowing well. So if you can come back to the pelvic health generally here. The symptoms, however, you can begin to work out yourself, will depend on where the fibroid is. So starting from the interior, you can have fibroids actually on little stalks, peduncles, growing into the womb as a polyp. And in that form, their main effect is likely to be barrier to fertility, because they're acting a bit like a coil. They're just irritating the womb lining. Because this is actually quite correct. The womb isn't sort of a big open cavity, it's actually closed, so these walls keep touching each other. So anything in the centre is going to act as an irritant. That's just the basis of the coil. It's a contraceptive device that simply irritates the womb lining and stops implantation. So that's the main effect. But you can also, particularly if it's not quite pedunculated, but is simply, if you like, stretching or extending the endometrial lining, that's when you get most likely to get problems with excessive bleeding at periods. And that's called menorrhagia, excessive bleeding at periods. And that remains the major problem, potential symptom of fibroids, is excessive bleeding during your periods, to the point, of course, of having real risk of anemia. One of the downsides of having regular menstrual cycle, remember that originally women wouldn't have for various reasons, but a menstrual bleed is a major, potentially, loss of iron from the body. So regularly menstruating women have always got borderline anemia, simply because it's difficult to make up the iron content from other functions that you're losing each month. If you're getting menorrhagia, this becomes a significant threat. And anemia is a hidden curse. We forget how important it is to well-being, to have low iron levels. It becomes something that becomes a bit of a priority. Maybe just because you've got a submucosal fibroid, or more than one, because sometimes you get on one at all. But that becomes a really pressing, literally, problem. And the unfortunate thing is that there isn't an obvious natural solution to this. There are a lot of people who claim to treat fibroids, but count your spoons before when they leave the house, because you can't really trust them. There isn't any evidence at all of natural treatment shrinking fibroids. The best way of shrinking fibroids is to go through the menopause. That's the natural way, because they're hormone dependent. It's the estrogens particularly that maintain the fibroids. They are an estrogen sensitive response in the womb wall. If it's an intramural fibroid, if it's moving a little bit away, you can have quite a few of them without there being many symptoms, but sometimes they can become quite profuse and lead to significant enlargement in effect of the womb, and that can have pressure on the bladder, even on the bowel, and general discomfortures of that sort because of how things are jammed together in the pelvis. But many young women can go through their whole life with quite a lot of intramural fibroids without too many symptoms. If it's a subseral, the serous membrane is the outer membrane. If it's a subseral fibroid, again, there may be few symptoms other than this might be impacting. Sometimes you can get these quite big. You know, grapefruit-sized fibroids are not uncommon. And of course that is likely to press upon inside the bladder. But what can sometimes happen is you get the same thing happening here as you get here, that the fibroid pedunculates, pushes its way right out of the womb, comes on the stalk, and then that becomes dangerous. Because out there it gets battered around by the movement of the intestines particularly. And the peduncle, the thing can twist, the peduncle in effect can break, and then you've got acute peritonitis, and that could be another acute abdomen to perplex the junior doctor who's in the emergency ward, faced with someone screaming on the bench and not knowing whether what it is until they go in there. But one of the possible reasons is because of a burst subcellular fibroid. So, different types of complication. Don't want to worry you. Doesn't often happen, but certainly fibroids are common. The most common consequence in most women's experience of fibroids is the excessive bleeding. So the question is, what can you do about it? Well, you can do everything you can to improve the circulation, improve the general health, and particularly nutritional health. Lots of omegas of the right sort, lots of the right minerals and vitamins. Remembering your iron intake, and if you're a vegan or vegetarian, that is a bit of a challenge because it's rather hard to get high input of iron from plant sources. But do what you can. Sorry, there's a W85 right here. So that's one of these on the stalk. Yeah. But you know, the sad fact is that sometimes surgery is the only thing that can make the difference if something has really got impacted there. The hope is that they can do a narrow myomectomy, just to take out that bit without affecting the rest of the hysterectomy is a last resort, which we obviously do everything we can to avoid. But there are cases where this is losing so much blood that there isn't much option. Keep our fingers crossed that that doesn't happen. What time are you finishing?
About now.
About now?
About now, 11:15, yeah.
Yeah, well let's quickly talk about the last thing that I've run on, but this is the polycystic ovary syndrome, where in that follicular phase we talked about, that's the most common phase of the cycle, the cysts don't burst. They remain, there's no ovulation, the cysts just get bigger and become permanent. Many cysts form and then disappear. They're called functional cysts. So you can get cyst symptoms, including inflammation, that only lasts as long as the cycle. And then the cyst bursts and you get them sort of back to normal. But sometimes they don't, and they just build up. And you can see lots of basically dormant, large cysts in the ovaries, all of which are still producing hormones. That's the problem. And polycystic ovarian syndrome, just stole this from somebody's website, has got lots of consequences, haven't they? There's a lot of androgenic involvement in this. The hormones involved include a lot of male hormones, androgens. So excessive hair or hirsutism, particularly on the face, is one consequence of it. It can affect and block your menstruation in certain situations because of the high levels of male hormones. Hair thinning and male pattern thinning can be a factor. You can get upset, skin colouring, the periods become irregular if they're not absent. Blood pressure can go up, weight gain, increasing obesity is a common problem, and this is important, a common factor in PCOS. Come back to that in a moment. Acne, again, androgen-induced, and mood changes. And a lot of women, particularly young women, do have this, so you're going to see it. Very quickly, because we are running out of time, the key hormone to watch for here is none of the above. You know which one it is?
Androgen. Insulin, PGA. Androgen.
Testosterone.
The ratio between
Insulin.
He's cheating. It's insulin. Insulin. This is an insulin-resistant phenomenon, very much so. And this is where things like weight gain, obesity, fat tissues become significant play, because fat cells, adipose tissue, compounds insulin resistance very well. But particularly for people who have this complication, can we be overriding hormonal factor? And so one way to get at PCOS is to tackle insulin resistance, which include dietary work. includes exercise. Anything that can reduce fat buildup is going to be critical in managing PCOS. And frankly, that's the angle that we always work on most. It's reducing insulin resistance. Whole big other story, isn't it? But that's the one to put a flag up on. It doesn't stop the cysts, it doesn't make them go away, it doesn't reduce their capacity to disrupt because they're producing excessive hormones. And again, in the extremists, you might just have to remove that ovary, because it's often just one, simply to reduce that massive surge of hormones. But we can do all we can to get all the other healthy benefits of the body to play their cards, and above all else, it's reducing adipose tissue every way you can. It's the hardest thing to do, as we all know, but it is the thing most probably effective. I should run on longer, but you can see it's a big topic. Any quick questions for this verse? Got enough to go on with? Read up now, fill in the gaps, get those herbs on board. And good luck, because a lot of your work will involve these problems.
All right, thank you very much, Simon.